Good morning. In this video, I'm going to record the notes for week 12, which is the week that has been rescheduled for AP Micro. So please make a note of the due dates because they'll be a little bit different this time. Okay, the first thing we're going to do in week 12 is we're going to review the marginal revenue equals marginal cost rule, which, as you should know by now, is the profit maximization rule or loss minimizing point for all firms, okay, as long as producing is preferable to shutting down. So for any firm in any market structure, they want to produce their output where MR equals MC. So take a moment and review for yourself the characteristics of a monopolistic competitor and the characteristics of an oligopoly. So pause the video and then come back and look at these characteristics. The characteristics of a monopolistic competitor are many sellers with differentiated products, which means they're selling something that is similar but not quite the same. So like different kinds of jeans, different kinds of shoes, different kinds of things that are done at nail salons, different daycare centers. There are no or very few barriers to entry, so it's very, very easy for other firms to enter, but again, they're not going to be making exactly the same product. There is non-price competition, which means there's quite a bit of advertising. There's some price setting power, which means at least in the short run, and possibly for a longer period of time, firms in monopolistic competition might see economic profit. And there is no collusion. Generally because there's so many firms in monopolistic competition that collusion is almost impossible. In oligopoly, and again, you should pause and think about what these characteristics are. To review, they are few sellers. The products might be differentiated, but they also might be homogeneous, like steel or oil. There are significant barriers to entry, either because the startup costs are so expensive, a lot of capital required, there could be some type of trade protection, could have to do with vertical integration. Some firms might own most of the resources. There's a number of different reasons. There is also non-price competition. It's targeted, which means they actually identify their competitors and name them in the advertising. Oligopolists tend to be price searchers, so they are closer to monopoly, and they have a tendency to collude. And next week, in week 13, we'll look more closely at oligopoly and how game theory is used to analyze their decision making. There is, as it says at the bottom, a fine line between the two. Fortunately, you already learned about this when you learned about the Herfindahl index when we initially introduced market structures in Unit 2. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the graph for monopolistic competition. And you can see here that the graph looks a whole lot like monopoly, right? There's really not a huge difference. Like a monopolist, the monopolistic competitor can actually see the demand curve, right? The monopolistic competitor will produce where MR equals MC. It's a very similar analysis to monopoly. Charge what the consumers are willing to pay, so we go up to the demand curve to find the price. So that part of the analysis looks exactly like monopoly. The big difference here is the elasticity of the demand curve. Notice how flat this demand curve is. Why is that? Because the monopolistic competitor faces substitute goods, close substitutes, right? The products are differentiated, but it's not like monopoly where no one can make anything at all like your good. If you're producing jeans, like Levi's, right, other people can't produce Levi's, but they can produce jeans. So what will happen if this firm is making a profit? In monopoly, our analysis was simple, end of story. Nothing can happen. If they're making a profit, nobody can enter the industry. But that is not the case for a monopolistic competitor. We don't have two side-by-side graphs. We don't have a separate industry and firm graph, so we're just going to keep our analysis to this firm graph. What happens to the firm? If this firm is making a profit, most likely we know that other firms will enter the industry. And what will happen then is we will see a leftward shift in the demand, right, for this particular firm's goods. Okay, so that's going to be the analysis for monopolistic competition. So we can see here what happens is other firms enter the market. Remember, barriers are low. So see what happened to demand and marginal revenue. They both have to shift because marginal revenue is derived from demand. Okay, so a new firm enters the market, the demand for Levi's shifts to the left, and now instead of having that nice profit, Levi's is taking a temporary short-run loss. Okay, but this is not sustainable. So if some firms are taking losses, right, some will leave. Some will leave the market. And if they don't leave in the short run, they're going to leave in the long run, right, when they can recover their fixed costs. Then what happens is the demand for the remaining curves or firms will shift back to the right again. So the equilibrium position is going to be right here. And it's not hard to understand, but it is a little bit tricky to draw. So the equilibrium position is similar to perfect competition. The graph looks like monopoly, but in perfect competition, we have a situation with no economic profit, and that's going to be the same here. So if you look at this graph, we have the demand curve and the marginal revenue for the monopolistic competitor with marginal cost, and we have the ATC lines. MR crosses MC gives us the quantity. Go up to the demand curve, that tells us the price. At this particular point, where we're tangent to the ATC curve, we actually have no economic profit, no incentive for more firms to enter, no losses, no incentive for firms to leave. So this is the equilibrium position, right? Nobody enters, nobody exits. So this is where it's going to remain until, of course, some new firm enters, right, and messes things up. So does monopolistic competition create productive efficiency? Remember, that question means, does the price equal minimum ATC? Well, minimum ATC is right here, right? The firm is clearly not operating at minimum ATC because they're tangent to that curve at a place where demand is not horizontal. So no, they're not producing at the efficient point. The price doesn't equal minimum ATC. They're not productively efficient. Are they allocatively efficient? Is the price equal to marginal cost? No, we actually have excess capacity, right? Because between this price, right, in the demand curve and this marginal cost line, we have places where the firm could sell more above the marginal cost of production. So the price is actually quite a bit higher than marginal cost. We could produce quite a bit more, right, to be allocatively efficient. So they're neither productively efficient nor allocatively efficient. There are advantages, however, to monopolistic competition. The disadvantage is, like monopoly, they produce less, they charge a higher price, they're not productively efficient, they're not allocatively efficient. Okay, those are all clear disadvantages. But the advantage is that we don't all have to go around wearing jeans that are just generic jeans or shirts that are just generic white t-shirts. We can actually pick out different goods that we like. If you want to go to a restaurant that serves, omelets made with 3 eggs and I only want 2 eggs, or somebody else wants egg whites, right? We all have choice. And so monopolistic competition leads consumers to have a lot of choice, and it's certainly closer to efficient than monopoly or oligopoly. This would be a sample free response question on monopolistic competition. Okay, you can see the graph there. It asks you to draw a correctly labeled graph that shows the profit maximizing firm's price and output, which you should be able to do. It's a little bit tricky, as I said. You want to really be careful. We'll practice this actually in class, what to draw first, because you have to, there's a lot of different pieces here. You have to have the ATC, of course, MC has to cross at minimum. You need a tangent demand line, and you need a marginal revenue line that is steeper than the demand line that intersects MC right below that tangent point on the demand curve. So it's a little bit tricky. It might take a couple tries to get it right. Assume the city in which this industry operates eliminates a business license fee, which is a fixed cost, for all firms. How does the elimination of the license fee affect each of the following for this individual firm in the short run? So I'm going to leave it to you to work on that problem. We will actually go through it in class to give a little bit of practice to think about what's going to happen if the fixed cost changes for a monopolistically competitive firm. Okay, a little bit more on oligopoly before we're done with this day. When we first looked at market structures, we looked at concentration ratios. You wrote some things in the Moodle assignment about the Herfindahl Index and about how the Justice Department uses Herfindahl indexes. Just wanted to also mention that there's something called either a 5-firm or 4-firm concentration ratio. And here, instead of squaring them, you're just adding up market shares. Okay, so if you add up market shares and of the top 4 or 5 firms and they're greater than 40%, some people would call that an oligopoly, and then the Herfindahl Index is greater than 1800. So those are ways of telling the difference between those two. Oligopoly, we're not actually going to use a traditional graph for oligopoly. The textbook does have, I believe your textbook has, a kink demand curve theory of oligopoly, which is the idea that the oligopolist demand curve actually has 2 different slopes. And the idea is that if you're at an equilibrium price, if the oligopolist were to raise the price, all the rivals would match it, so it would be very elastic demand. But if they were to, if they were to raise the price, the rivals would not necessarily match it, but if they were to lower the price, the rivals would all match it. So they would match a price cut, they would ignore a price increase, so it's kinked at the current price with 2 different elasticities. But the College Board doesn't really use that theory, and you're not going to be tested on it. So the key here is just to understand that prices in oligopoly are relatively stable, and that raising the price would probably eliminate your consumer base, and lowering the price wouldn't really help you. So next week, when you come back from the break, you will learn more about oligopoly. In particular, we're going to learn about game theory and about how oligopolists are interdependent, meaning one firm's behavior, one firm's decisions, one firm's profits are going to depend on the decisions of other firms. We'll also learn about how oligopolists are tempted to merge to become one firm. They're also tempted to collude, which means they're tempted to do things like price fixing, which is illegal. Oligopolists, we also believe, are not productively efficient because they would restrict production in order to increase their own profits, and they don't produce at minimum ATC. They're also not allocatively efficient, and we know that because most oligopolists actually do earn significant economic profit. So price is greater than marginal cost. That's the end of the notes for today. So remember to check the assignments that will be due over the break.